Well, this was so bad, you can even say it was a monstrosity. What's going on, everyone? Welcome back to my channel. Today we're talking about a brand new release, The Munsters. Before we begin, let me know in the comments what your thoughts on this movie are, if you already saw it or if you were planning on seeing it. And make sure to hit that thumbs up button if you like these videos, as it helps me out immensely by getting my content out there. And if you're new here, I hope you consider hitting that subscribe button so you can stay up to date with more movie related content on a near daily basis. But let's not waste any more time and let's talk about The Munsters. This focuses on the vampire Lily, who falls in love with Herman, a 7-foot-tall green experiment with a heart of gold. It's love at first shock as these two ghouls fall fangs over feet over each other. Unfortunately, it's not all smooth sailing as Lily's father has other plans for his beloved daughter's future. This is written and directed by Rob Zombie, and while I've enjoyed his work as a musician, I've never really bothered with his film work all too much outside of his Halloween. But what made him such an intriguing fit for this going into it is that Zombie has made it known how much of a fan he is of the original show. And that immediately had me intrigued. I watched The Munsters growing up, and I always enjoyed it. In fact, I was even more of a fan of that show than the Addams Family. There was so much fun in watching this family who felt like they embodied the typical American household, but were always oblivious to the fact that everyone was afraid of them for being monsters, which usually led to some really funny gags. And it would certainly be an interesting mix here, considering Zombie is known for his foul-mouthed, gory, violent, hyper-stylized horror movies. And for this would be his first foray into something more family-friendly, as he wanted to stay true to the show. I was curious to see how this would mesh, and as a fan of the show, my expectations were actually pretty high, especially after seeing some of the set photos, which looked great. Now, what I will say is, after seeing the final product, a lot of care was put into a lot of the set designs. In a day and age where a lot of CGI and green screen is used to create these larger, elaborate scenarios, or sometimes be used in lieu of a traditional set, it was refreshing to see this lean in considerably to using practical effects, costumes, and custom-built sets. It all looked like there was a lot of attention to detail. And while I wish this was shot in black and white to recreate the feel of the show, it at least gave us some eye-catching, vibrant, colorful visuals that would go nicely with some of the hyper-stylized visuals Zombie would inject from time to time. And going with that, there were some decent standouts in the cast. I do think Daniel Roebuck, who plays the Count, he's not called Grandpa as Eddie and Marilyn aren't here, I thought he did a solid job, essentially playing into the campier elements of the story. He knew what kind of movie he was in, and he tried to make it fun. I also appreciated Richard Brake as Dr. Wolfgang, the scientist who brought Herman to life, along with Jorge Garcia as his assistant Floop, both of whom also tried to go over the top as your typical mad scientist and assistant duo. They might not be the main focus of the movie, but whenever we saw them, they were a nice bright spot. So with them, I'd get some decent chuckles. But unfortunately, that's about all I can really say as far as the positives, as this otherwise falls flat for me. This fails both as an adaptation of the show, as well as just on its own. As far as its relation to the show, this is supposed to be a prequel, showing how Herman met Lily, showing their marriage, moving to Mockingbird Lane, and so on. Jeff Daniel Phillips and Sherry Moon Zombie play Herman and Lily, and unlike Roebuck, unfortunately, these two are severely miscast. Now, the writing didn't do them any favors, which we'll get to, but there was simply no chemistry between these two, so it was hard to completely buy into their romance. And when it came to their individual deliveries, they just felt off. Sherry Moon Zombie would try giving Lily this very bubbly personality, adding a lot of inflection towards the end of almost all her sentences, and she'd usually do so in a very repetitive way that never once came off as charming. And then Jeff Daniel Phillips, his voice simply does not match what you think of when it comes to the very tall, booming Herman. Phillips's voice was already a little higher pitched to start out with, but then it would also repeatedly and very sporadically crack, and it would just feel very awkward. And while I tried to judge this on its own merits and to understand that this simply isn't Fred Gwynne and no one can be Fred Gwynne, it's not exactly always the easiest to separate that when Zombie purposely looked to supposedly create the exact same aesthetic that lined up with the original show. So I never fully got those comparisons out of my head, and all I saw was this guy who wasn't Fred Gwynne trying to embody that same Herman, but with this incredibly awkward delivery that just did not match the show whatsoever. And then the writing as a whole would feel very sloppy. Despite the fact that Zombie is a self-professed big fan of the Munsters, I would have never been able to guess that here. This felt like it was written by someone who has no understanding of what made the show so much fun, as a lot of the same magic wasn't there. Again, the characterizations just don't line up for a movie that's supposed to be a direct prequel to the original show. Instead of seeing these characters try living among society, just oblivious to everyone's fears of them, you'll instead have these gag-heavy moments of Lily dating Count Orlok or Herman in a punk rock band, and it would try to lean into this quirkiness, but these gags generally would have no punchline to them. Sometimes it would just be the sight of these characters performing a specific act in and of itself that's supposed to be funny, but it just wouldn't work. So with that, there honestly was just no compelling narrative driving this forward. While this covers various plot points that I mentioned, like Herman and Lily meeting and getting married and so on, every one of these moments felt like a random subplot rather than part of a larger story that would drive the movie forward. Like if I were to try telling you what this movie was about, outside of that general synopsis that I read at the beginning of this review, I really couldn't say, actually. It doesn't stay on any one particular plot point for far too long, so there was never really any sort of emotional highs or intriguing story elements that I could latch onto. It felt very aimless. There were some chuckle-worthy moments, but that's just all they were. Moments. And to go with that, the sense of humor was not funny. Again, there were some moments where I chuckled, but a lot of the jokes would just be characters telling these very corny, safe dad jokes, usually filled with bad puns and awkward pauses, almost like they were purposely added in so they can wait for the laugh. Probably the most infamous of the puns is the fact that Herman's last name winds up being Munster because the character played by Jorge Garcia names him after the cheese. And honestly, that doesn't even make me annoyed in and of itself, but I cite that as an example of that essentially setting the tone for the rest of this movie. And honestly, this felt more in line with a low-budget TV movie that you'd soon find in like a bargain bin, rather than a proper film. Despite all the attention to detail in the set design, the way it's all shot with that soap opera look, it just really undermines all those efforts, giving it this very cheap feel that would repeatedly take me out of the moment. It was hard to get invested in this world and feel like we're back in the universe of the Munsters because it didn't try immersing us in this universe beyond some nice looking sets and costumes. Which leads me to wonder who this movie's ultimately for, because I can't see anyone really latching onto this unless just out of curiosity. I can't see Munsters fans liking it because it just fails as an adaptation. Rob Zombie fans won't like it since stylistically it's nothing like his other movies. It's not going to win over any newcomers of either fan base, especially because the writing is so subpar and corny, and while it's family friendly, the jokes are so dull that I can't even see younger audiences enjoying it. So it doesn't stand on its own, so I really don't know who something like this is ultimately going to appeal to. Despite being helmed by such a distinct director and it's about a fairly notable IP, it just feels bland and generic and more like style over substance. So in the end, I just can't see this really winning anyone over, to be quite honest. The Munsters is a major disappointment. It fails both as an adaptation of the show, as well as just on its own. Despite some elaborate set designs and costumes that you really have to commend, on top of some chuckle-worthy moments from a solid supporting cast, its two leads are gravely miscast, it fails to capture any of the spirit that made the original show so enjoyable, and even on its own it feels aimless, mostly unfunny, and has no compelling narrative whatsoever. And it ultimately leads to an experience that's going to alienate both the pre-existing fan bases of Rob Zombie and the Munsters, as well as anyone tuning in for the first time. The Munsters gets a 4 out of 10. So let me know, did you see The Munsters, or are you planning to see it, and what were your thoughts? Were you a fan of the show, and how does this compare to Rob Zombie's other films? Let me know in the comments below so we can discuss. Also, if you enjoyed this video, please give it a like, and share it, and for more movie reviews and film discussion, please make sure to hit that subscribe button to stay updated. Thanks for watching everyone, and keep having fun with film.